From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
How did we get in this situation where we have a completely porous southern border and we've got human trafficking and drug trafficking? Say what you want about him, President Biden was very clear that he wanted that. He was clear even the months leading up to his inauguration. He was kind of saying, come on over. The day he was inaugurated, he repealed all those executive orders that had been patched together by the previous administration to control the border. He's getting what he wanted.
This is your host, Scot Bertram, and that's Mollie Hemingway, Senior Journalism Fellow at Hillsdale College, Editor-in-Chief at the Federalist, and Fox News contributor. We talk with Mollie in depth this week about a couple of topics, including the latest on the Missouri v. Biden free speech case and how blue city mayors and blue city governors are now talking about immigration. Mollie, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here with you.
Wanted to talk about a couple of topics with you today. In a while, we'll get to the subject of immigration. But first, I wanted to talk about social media, free speech, the First Amendment, some issues we touch on in Rigged, of course. Late last week, we had the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals uphold a lower court ruling on a case, Missouri v. Biden, which deals with the government and their ability to interact and make requests or demands of social media companies. There are so many court cases making their way through. I'm not sure people know specifically what's at issue here in Missouri v. Biden. Tell us what this is about.
There are many court cases going through, but this one is extremely important, brought by the Attorneys General of Missouri and Louisiana against the Biden administration and a few agencies in particular within the executive branch of government for how they colluded with big tech companies or how they made big tech companies censor American speech in contradiction with the First Amendment. And this case has been fascinating to follow. You saw the first injunction come out on Independence Day, which was, I thought, beautifully timed by the judge, telling the federal government they had to cease going after people's First Amendment rights through this collusion with big tech companies to censor speech. And the Biden administration, kind of surprisingly, I think, appealed that, and that was upheld then last week. This is very important because so much of what the federal government has gotten into in recent years is censoring free speech. They were telling tech companies to severely restrict the right of Americans to discuss news and information about COVID and other very important issues that affect our lives. And I don't think people realize just how expansive this effort has been. You have Department of Homeland Security, the CDC, multiple parts of the Department of Defense who are allocating tremendous resources to censor free thought and expression from Americans.
The judge in the district court who made the original decision said in his opinion that this is the most massive attack against free speech in U.S. history. Do you think that's hyperbole or correct?
It's not even close. It's something that I don't think people would have even tried before. They certainly would have had the ability to do what they've done. But you have so many federal employees and their budgets allocated toward censorship of speech and information. And this case deals mostly with COVID, but it's across all sorts of things that affect Americans, where the federal government or agents within different departments of the government are working to keep people from having open and free debate. When you think about the First Amendment and what it's there to protect, it's not, it's speech rights and press rights and really the ability of people to get together to discuss what's true and to find truth. And it's a hallmark of who we are as Americans that we protect this. And that in the last 20 plus years, we have worked so hard to get into the censorship business is really sobering.
What do we know is true in this case? I mean, what's not really at issue in terms of what the government did in relation to their conversations with the social media companies?
I don't think there's much dispute that there were a lot of budget resources allocated toward censorship. The government's perspective is that they had to censor news and information about COVID for good reason, and that's what people always say when they're restricting people's rights. Oh, we did it for their own good. But there's not really debate about whether they did it. And there is no debate about whether there are these meetings and email traffic between high-level government officials and high-level big tech operators discussing how to suppress information. And sometimes people say, well, if it's true, then it shouldn't be censored. It's also such that you have the right to share things that other people say is not true. It's not really the government's role to determine what are the appropriate contours of speech. And frequently, someone saying something that is not held by the consensus turns out to be true. So but there's no debate about whether there was this massive operation going on. You had federal government officials bragging about how much they were doing there, and it's all in paper and has been discovered. That's actually my favorite thing about this case. You can go through just tons of explosive emails between agents in the government and the big tech firms just openly talking about how to deal with the people who are causing them problems by sharing information they wish they hadn't.
Mollie Hemingway with us. We talk about Missouri v. Biden, this case about social media, First Amendment and government coercion. This includes, again, not really at issue, content, viewpoints that didn't violate social media companies' policies and in some cases acknowledged to be true. That's the kind of content in this case that was suppressed at the government's behest. And what the case, I guess, alleges too is that it's not just a request, but there was some coercion happening on behalf of the government to entice these companies to take that action.
Yeah, and whenever you have the power of the federal government under which you're regulated telling you to do stuff, generally the courts view that as a coercion, even if there weren't overt demands or, quid pro quos associated with it. The government, also this, one thing that's interesting about this, a lot of people are angry at big tech for their censorship, and rightly so. It's really contrary to the values that we hold as Americans. But in the case of the federal government's involvement, that's just against the Constitution. So that's a much bigger issue. You can dislike what Twitter and Facebook have done to control news and information, but that the government was involved makes this is why this case is doing so well and why so much has come out in discovery, because that is so clearly in violation of the Constitution in the view of many people. And now we've got, we had the lower court judge and now this upholding of the injunction that he instituted. And so they wouldn't be doing that if they didn't think there was a lot of merit to the case brought by Missouri.
And we've talked about this in previous conversations, but it continues a trend. Previously, we talked about it with relation to journalists and journalism, in which they see a goal of their work now as limiting, suppressing, controlling the type of information that eventually gets to the consumer, to protect the consumer. The government steps in these cases, whether it be about vaccine skeptical content or what they consider misinformation on climate change or gender, to again consider it their role to protect, suppress information that could make it to the public, but for their own good. The explanation always is this is to protect the people.
Right. So we see it clearly with the censorship around COVID-related issues. So in the real world, there aren't easy answers on things like whether this vaccine is good or bad. You have to cover all sorts of things. It might be good for certain people and not good for other people. But the way that our government and other members of our controlling classes looked at it was, if you allow anyone to have an open and honest conversation about the pluses and minuses of this thing, it might lead to fewer people taking this vaccine. And our real goal is not to accurately report news and information. It's to control the people and control the outcomes. And so therefore, we have to do this. So it's very clear to see how it works in the COVID debate, but it also is being applied to everything. Mm-hmm. If we let people have open and honest conversations about the trans agenda, then they might not come to the desired outcome that we would like. Or if we are honest about what happens in abortion or what's going on with the economy or what the effects of policy decisions are. So they're trying to control everything at all times in a way that people my age, think is reminiscent of the Soviet Union, how they were controlling speech and information, and completely contrary to what we thought, what a lot of people I think thought were our founding ideals.
And this also, I think, goes to a misunderstanding about how content is consumed. That if you put an X input in, you get a Y output. If someone sees this, they're going to believe this or think this way. And it steps back from this assumption that people can make up their own minds.
Right, or that someone puts out an idea and then other people respond to that idea, and that all of that gets consumed in a way that people then critically analyze. They definitely are treating people, I don't know if it's projection or a sign of how they consume news and information, but they definitely are not viewing other people as independent thinkers.
Mollie Hemingway with us. She is Senior Journalism Fellow at Hillsdale College, Editor-in-Chief at Federalist, and also a Fox News contributor. I wanted to talk about the topic of immigration on the whole, but start specifically with the actions that have prompted some of the reconsideration of policies in areas. And this is the busing that Governor Abbott in Texas, the busing that Governor DeSantis in Florida started some months ago, moving migrants by their own accord, by their own agreement, to other areas of the country, these sanctuary cities like Chicago, New York, states like Massachusetts, and leaders in those areas having to deal with the actual consequences of their policy decisions or their rhetoric, and they don't like what they have found. Why did it take so long to stumble upon this seemingly very effective way of taking the immigration debate and the real-world consequences to other parts of the country besides Texas?
Yeah, it took a long time because it was reasonable to assume there would be a lot of pushback to an attempt like this. And for whatever reason, a lot of Republican leaders are cowardly when it comes to negative attention from the press. It was amazing when this first happened. It was so fascinating. You have these people who are given an opportunity, who have crossed into the country illegally, given an opportunity to go to a different location. They go to the other locations, and the leaders of these areas freak out. They're so upset that they have to deal with, frankly, a paltry number of illegal immigrants. Communities throughout the country have been dealing with overflows of illegal immigrants for decades. Mm-hmm. I mean, you go to small towns in Nebraska that are having major difficulties in managing their school system and their health systems because of how many people have crossed illegally and made their way to Nebraska. All of a sudden, when it hits Martha's Vineyard, New York City, Chicago, Washington, D.C., one of the busloads was dropped off right at the vice president's house in Washington, D.C., and Griff Jenkins, one of our reporters at Fox News, was out there covering it, and it was amazing to watch. Like, nobody knew what to do. Everyone was just appalled that this would be happening, and it showed everyone, because so many people throughout the country have dealt with this in their own communities, in their own states, that these people who talk a big talk about how important it is to have a completely porous and open border, all of a sudden, the moment you have to deal with just a tiny little bit of that, now it's a different story altogether.
This brings the question, how has Texas done it for so long? These, dozens, sometimes hundreds of immigrants causing major problems in cities that don't know how to deal with them. Housing, feeding, all of those questions. Texas has done it with exponentially more migrants coming across the border for a far longer time. How has Texas even done it?
Right. Like last week, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, was saying that if we allow this to continue unabated, it's going to destroy the city. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people were surprised since he's such a far-left Democrat. He had loudly condemned any idea of control of our borders and said that that's not who we are as a people just a few years ago. And now he's saying, like, it's putting our entire city at risk. As a percentage of the New York population, what they're dealing with is a tiny, tiny fraction of some of these border towns in Texas. Now, part of the story is that immigration across the border back and forth is a story that's been going on for a long time, for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. California, Arizona, Texas, they are better at dealing with it because a big part of their economy, just to be honest, has been fueled by migrant workers one way or the other. There's also just a tremendous amount of generosity and state resources applied. They were increasingly sounding the alarm for many years now about the trouble that they were having. And the federal government was poo-pooing them. So it's gotten to be very difficult in Texas. Nobody cared. And that's, I think, what provoked some of this. Okay, fine, you're going to have to deal with some of this as well.
When you hear some of the language from Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, governor of Massachusetts, other blue state, blue city leaders, it seems evident they still actually don't get it, because the solutions they are proposing are work visas and housing in ways that would actually increase the flow to their cities, right? If their cities are giving these things away and assisting these migrants who arrive in this manner, the flow will merely increase. There's nothing to stop at the source.
But to me, there's an internal consistency with them. They do believe in open borders. They do believe it's wrong to tell anyone that they do not have right to the country. And if they can get other people to pay for everything that goes along with that, then it is sort of fine for them. And they like some of the demographic change that comes with that, meaning they like to have like a permanent underclass that can be controlled, that can provide goods and resources for the elites at a fraction of the price that it would cost if it were natural born or otherwise citizens of the United States who have, all the rights afforded them. So they've been consistent. And that's one of the things, like, people go, how did we get in this situation where we have a completely porous southern border and we've got human trafficking and drug trafficking? Say what you want about him. President Biden was very clear that he wanted that. He was clear even the months leading up to his inauguration. He was kind of saying, come on over. Mm-hmm. The day he was inaugurated, he repealed all those executive orders that had been like patched together by the previous administration to control the border. He's getting what he wanted. And there are advantages and ways to keep in power using like this permanent underclass.
I'm not sure how closely you're watching what's happening in Chicago. The mayor there, Brandon Johnson, who is a far left progressive, is talking now about tax increases for Chicago residents to pay for the migrants who are in the city. He has proposed building massive tent cities in areas of the city over the winter where these migrants would be housed. I'm not sure how that would work. There is an elected Chicago Democrat, an alderman, who, when asked about what are the alternatives, he said, you can turn the buses around and send them back where they came from. This his name
Donald Trump?
It was not. But this sort of rhetoric, which of course, if it came from President Trump or anyone on the right would be denounced as racist and xenophobic, is simply a day-to-day occurrence now on the left. It's incredible how the discussion has flipped completely.
Yes, but also the more interesting thing I think about all of that was that the Chicago mayor is trying to continue it. Mm-hmm. And you look at a state like California, which now is almost like uninhabitable unless you are a wealthy, wealthy person or a very poor person. They've driven out the middle class. And that has been a conscious thing. Like their tax receipts are fine. They are happy that when they lose the middle class because they don't have room for everybody and they just want to have these high and low things. I think Chicago looks at California and says, we could copy that. There's also this major nonprofit realm that exists and makes its money. I know they're technically nonprofits, but they make their money by taking part in the relief of these efforts. Mm-hmm. That is also probably supporting this politically.
There's millions and millions of dollars in contracts. That's why the tent cities have been proposed, because Chicago is saying we're paying millions to these agencies to take care of these people, and we have to find a cheaper way that we can do it ourselves. President Biden has proposed, or at least floated this idea, that he now wants to limit migrants who have come across the border to Texas, not allow them to leave Texas. My question, of course, is if they can't prevent them from coming across the border, how can they prevent them from leaving the state of Texas and going elsewhere in the country?
Right. You can point out that makes no sense or that they're being hypocritical, but they just do it through power. It's like what you were mentioning with this New Mexico governor, like using the power that they have. We could keep people from crossing the border into Texas. They choose not to. They could instead allocate their resources to keep people. And it's one of those things that you can do it also by just making life very difficult, making it illegal to bus people out of state using resources to do that. We are starting to see, this like an interesting federalism happening where you're definitely starting to see tension between the feds and state governments. And at some point, something's going to come into a real clash, and people should be behaving in a more prudential fashion about how much they're provoking states here.
In the end, do you think that any or all of this really changes the conversation about this issue as we lead up to 2024?
Oh, it has. I feel like the conversation has completely changed because of what you said with mayors like Eric Adams and other people. Like they're instituting emergency orders in different states. It was treated for a long time because I think some wealthy people on the left just weren't having to deal with this in anything other than a positive way. Like they were very happy to use illegal immigrant labor for their goods and resources. And now it's just changed dramatically. So I think it'll be harder. I mean, it was a big issue for Biden in 2020 to open up the border, and a lot of people thought that they were virtuous and good for supporting having a porous border, even though that allows all sorts of human trafficking and drug crimes and all that. And now that'll be a much more difficult issue to run on in 2024, even with a media that will do its best to help.
Mollie Hemingway, she is Senior Journalism Fellow at Hillsdale College, Editor-in-Chief at the Federalist, also Fox News contributor. Her most recent book, Rigged. You can find her on X, formerly Twitter, at MZ Hemingway. Mollie, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
Up next, Todd Mack from Hillsdale's Spanish Department returns for part 2 of his conversation about Don Quixote. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Hey, it's Scot Bertram, and I've got a challenge for you today. Become a better educated American citizen. And to help you do just that, we at Hillsdale College have our free online courses available for all who wish to learn. Our challenge? Take just one of our courses. There are so many to choose from. You can discover the beauty of the Bible and the Genesis story, study the writings of C.S. Lewis, or explore the true meaning of America in Constitution 101. We have dozens more to choose from, and all these self-paced free courses feature Hillsdale faculty and scholars, many you've heard on this podcast. So visit hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE, and pick one of the more than 30 free Hillsdale courses. I hope you'll accept my challenge. Pick whichever course you like and become a more educated citizen today. Go to hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. Find older episodes of this program plus others like Imprimis, The Larry Arnn Show, and the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Todd Mack from Hillsdale's Spanish Department, returning for a second week to finish off our conversation on the famed Cervantes novel Don Quixote. Last week we focused on Book 1. Today we'll talk about the very end of Book 1 and also all of Book 2. Todd, so what happens at the end of Part 1? And I guess for readers at that time, it would be the end of the book. Part 2 doesn't come for 10 more years.
Yeah.
So how does this part of the book come to an end?
So there's the story of Don Quixote over the 3 big parts of the book. There's 3, they call them sallies. So he sallies forth the first time alone and then comes home. Then he picks up Sancho, then he goes out again. And the bulk of Book 1 is this second sally. So he's out, he does a bunch of things, sees the windmills, gets lost in the mountains, goes back to the inn. And towards the end, he comes across some prisoners. It's like a chain gang. And he thinks that they're captives of something. So he ends up freeing them all, all these criminals. And Sancho says, we're going to get busted. We're going to get in big trouble for this. And it turns out that he does. So essentially the police come and they grab Sancho and Quixote and they throw Quixote in a cage. And they beat him up, and then he gets beat up by some other people, and he gets beat up a bunch. He gets beat up a lot in this story. And eventually they take him home, and he just rests. And then the narrator says, I've heard there's these oral stories about Quixote, that he went out again. People say that he went out again a third time. I haven't been able to find any documentation that verifies that. But I've heard that he went and fought in these jousts in Zaragoza and stuff. Maybe that was. So he kind of leaves the door open for maybe there's going to be a second part.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it ends, basically. Quixote beaten, still delusional, and his niece is kind of taking care of him. His friends are happy that he's back now and that he's not out wandering around the La Mancha countryside.
So the second part, it's somewhat alluded to, as you mentioned at the end of the first part. Is it always planned to be this way by Cervantes? Was it due to popular demand? Where does a part two come about?
It's very successful. The first part of the novel is very successful. It gets translated pretty quickly. People are reading this and they're really liking it. So Cervantes is always, he's planning from the beginning to write a second part. And we get the sense that he's working on it. At some point, somebody whose name is Avellaneda, which is not a real person, publishes their own second part of Don Quixote. It's in 1614. And at that point, it's not very long after that Cervantes publishes his official second part of Don Quixote, which is amazing because the fake Quixote from Avellaneda actually ends up showing up in Cervantes' Quixote. And he spends the last quarter or third of the second part of the novel just absolutely lambasting Avellaneda and this fake Quixote. And there are people he meets the fake Quixote. He meets people who say they have met the fake Quixote. And he's like, that guy's a fake. I'm the real Quixote. And they go, you know what? You're right, because you're way better than that other guy that's a fake guy. So it seems like there's a point where Cervantes became aware that this guy had published this thing.
Yeah.
The story turns pretty dramatically and sends us towards the end of book 2, which is pretty definite.
Do we see changes in the characters in Don Quixote and Sancho Panza from part 1 to part 2?
Yeah, I mean, the entire part 2 is that's my favorite part of the book. Everybody points to the windmill scene, which is great, but in part 2, the interesting thing is that Quixote and Sancho go out, and it pretty soon becomes clear that they're living in a world where the first part of their book has already been published and people have read it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, this idea of like metafiction, right? This is a story about stories and a story about reading. It's also a story about characters who know they are characters in a story because the first part of their story has already been published. People have read it. And people take advantage of that. And so in the first part of Quixote, he has to do a lot of creative effort. So he sees windmills and he says, Sancho, they're giants. And Sancho's like, I don't know. They look a lot like windmills to me. And he says, oh, they're giants. I'm going to go fight them. Or he goes into an inn and says, this is a castle. In the second part of the novel, people start dressing up and doing like cosplay kind of stuff to mess with Quixote because they know this guy's easily duped. At one point, he comes across a duke and duchess who have what seem like unlimited funds. They have castle. They hire all these people to come and dress up and pretend like this is a medieval fantasy. And so a bunch of the second book takes place in a virtual reality. Quixote's living in a virtual reality. And it's at that point that he starts to kind of notice there's something that's not right here. And so it becomes very interesting, very philosophical. He has to do way less of that kind of the effort, the legwork of creating the fantasy. And I think it allows him more time to kind of observe what's going on. Sancho becomes a governor of an island for a time of these people who are all, it's just this giant ruse. And so over time, there is some change. Sancho, who has been promised throughout the first novel and the beginning of the second novel that he will become a governor of the island, becomes governor of the island and realizes this is not for me. So he kind of takes a step back from that and decides, maybe I should just go home. This adventure's getting kind of long in the tooth. And then Quixote eventually he ends up finding his way home. And his change at the end is really quite radical and controversial. And there are people who won't accept that's actually what happened. A lot of people think that Cervantes wrote the end of Quixote the way that he did just to keep anybody from writing any more fake,
continuing, right? Yeah,
fake sequels. The end is it's a very definitive end.
Todd Mack from Hillsdale's Spanish department with us talking about book 2 of Don Quixote. So, Todd, how exactly does this all wrap up in the end?
So what happens is one of his friends, Sasson Carrasco, who's worried about him, dresses up as a knight. He calls himself the Knight of the White Moon. And there's the point where the Avellaneda, this fake Quixote, shows up. His plan initially is to go to Zaragoza and participate in some jousting tournament. There's no jousting tournament at Zaragoza in 1615. When he meets the Avellaneda Quixote, he changes course and heads out to Barcelona, which is a different direction. Not the complete opposite direction of where he was going, but like a 90-degree turn, which is heading out to the sea. He gets to the sea. He meets the Knight of the White Mirrors on the ocean, on the shore of the ocean. It's all very like archetypal, and there's tons of symbolism. And he gets beaten by his friend in a jousting match. And the guy really hurts Quixote, and he's injured, and he's a weak old man anyway. And it's sort of the culmination of all of the beatings that he's taken. And the guy, this Knight of the White Moon says, if you lose to me, then you have to do whatever I say. And so he loses. And so Quixote says, I'll do whatever you say. And the guy says, you have to go home and you have to rest and not do any more knight errantry for at least a year. So he does. He goes home, and there's still some kind of delusion. It takes him a while to get home. To walk from Barcelona to La Mancha, wherever he is, that's it's like many days or weeks. Eventually he makes it home. He rests. And when he wakes up, all the delusions are gone. And he says, I know who I am. I'm Alonso Quijano el Bueno. I just want to be a good man, and I want to die. A good man. And his friends are all sad because there is something really beautiful and romantic in the adventures. And they see that he's dying, and that at least when he was having these adventures, he was kind of full of life. And now he doesn't seem as full of life. And they're worried about him. And so they say, let's go have more adventures. And he says, I'm done with that. God has opened my eyes. He has redeemed me from my madness. And now I just want to die. And then he dies. And it's very melancholy. It's very sad, but also, I think, really beautiful. And it gets into this long debate about Quixote's madness and what is the nature of that. There's a very early scene, very on, when they say, don't you know this guy? And he says, I know who I am. And you go, what does that line mean, right? When he says, I know who I am, does that mean I know that I know who I am? I really am Alonso Quijano or Quixada or whatever. And I'm just pretending to do this because it's better to pretend to live a great life than to really, in actuality, live a very dull life. Or when he says, I know who I am, is he like completely lost? He thinks he's Don Quixote and he's really not. He really doesn't know who he is. And the way that you interpret what's going on when he's mad says a lot about how you're going to interpret the end of the novel. If you see his madness as true madness, then you feel a sense of relief at the end. Yeah. He's kind of been pulled out of this delusion. If you see his madness as something really beautiful and inspiring, and the way that he can see something mundane, and yet because of the kind of attention that he pays to it, it's like he creates something beautiful with his imagination. Well, the death of that sounds like something very sad. And I don't know that it has to be all one or the other, just like none of this novel is all one or the other. It's this constant turning of the wheel. And it gets us at the end there. And so it's a complicated ending. I think it's really beautiful. I find a lot of comfort in it. I know people that refuse to even read the end of the novel. It's like the first 3 Star Wars movies. It's like, I'm going to pretend that those do not exist because they change something that I really love in ways that I don't like. And so we'll just pretend they don't exist.
Let me ask very quickly before we leave Don Quixote. As a Spanish professor, are there advantages to reading it in its native language as opposed to reading translations?
There are always advantages of reading things in the language that they're written in, because words point to reality in interesting ways, and different words point to reality in different ways. Some words are just the same, right? And some words are different, but even the sound of words, and there's so much that goes into a language that to say, oh, it's just the same. It's just not the same. but the translations can be very good.
Yeah.
And they can go a long way towards transmitting the kind of the essence of the thing to us. And in their own right, to sit down and translate all of Quixote, it's 1,000 pages, is a literary feat in itself. And so, like the translation that I'll be teaching this next semester, I'll be teaching a Quixote class here on campus. We're using Edith Grossman's translation, which is pretty recent, and it's amazing. It's beautiful, it's modern, but touches on you feel like you're reading something from the 17th century, and it's not challenging really in the way that reading something actually from the 17th century can be.
Yeah.
It's an amazing literary feat in and of itself. And I love it as a book. It's really good. It's also not the original Spanish, which is also amazing in its own way and is able to play with words and do things with the language that you just can't do with translation.
Dr. Todd Mack, Associate Professor of Spanish Chair here at Hillsdale College, as we talk about Don Quixote. Dr. Mack, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
Up next, we talk with Stan Crosley, 1985 graduate of Hillsdale College and Distinguished Alumni Award winner for his achievements in data, privacy, and cybersecurity. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Mollie Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Find a radio station playing the show in your area. Go to radiohour.hillsdale.edu and click on the Affiliates tab. We're joined now by Stan Crosley. He's a 1985 graduate of Hillsdale College, on campus to receive a Distinguished Alumnus Award, Outstanding Professional Achievement in Data Privacy and Cybersecurity. He's founder and managing partner of Crosley Law Offices, creator of Red Barn Strategy, former chief privacy officer of Eli Lilly and Company. A lot of interesting things to talk about here with Stan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell our listeners first a little about your experience here at Hillsdale, what you majored in, what you did here in the early 80s.
Well, I showed up on the doorstep of Hillsdale College in 1981, ready to play some basketball, ready to study some biology and chemistry, and managed to do both of those things for 1 year and then got injured. Then played basketball again my senior year. Great experience all the way around. But Hillsdale was really here as an academic pursuit for me. And biology and chemistry was where I wanted to go. I was going to be a doctor like everybody else who studies biology.
That didn't happen, though.
It definitely did not happen. Organic chemistry got in the way of that a little bit, along with just my desire of pursuing medicine kind of fell to the side of more interest in business or law, maybe.
You're here to receive an award for Outstanding Professional Achievement in Data Privacy and Cybersecurity. So what's the path from biology and science into law and eventually data privacy and cybersecurity?
Path may be an overstatement. It's probably more of a thicket that kind of went through this area. When I graduated Hillsdale, I started as a pharmaceutical sales rep with Upjohn, now a part of Pfizer. And about 6 months into my tenure in sales, my district manager looked at me and said, "Stan, you are terrible at sales, but I would love it if you were my son. And I realized that I had not found the pursuit of my heart. And so left Detroit, went to Phoenix, became a commercial real estate broker, did a few other things, and finally found my way back to law school. Went to law school, and once I graduated, I realized this was really what I was meant to do. I had a passion for advising and counseling, working with companies, and it was a lot of fun, but I still wanted to get back to biology. And that's where Eli Lilly and Company came in.
Chief Privacy Officer, and if I recall, one of the first chief privacy officers at any major corporation in the country. What does that job description look like, and how were you qualified to do it?
Well, the first question is easier to answer than the second. My qualifications were pretty thin, like anybody else, in 2000 when the rule came about. Actually, Eli Lilly and Company suffered a data breach in 2001. And as a result of that data breach, the Federal Trade Commission began an investigation in multiple states. And my general counsel at the time at Eli Lilly and Company said, Stan, you seem to know something about this area. Maybe you should defend us in this prosecution, which I did, not necessarily successfully, I have to say. But as a result, I was made a chief privacy officer. So my qualifications were basically, I was the guy she looked at and said, he probably has the capability to do this. At the time, there really were no privacy lawyers. There were no privacy officers in any companies. It was a very nascent profession. And so we picked it up and started running with it. The way it looks is very different from company to company. There are 130 countries now in the world that have comprehensive data privacy laws. And so the role of a chief privacy officer is to kind of look at the operations of the company, determine where the risks might be with respect to data, the data that's collected. And data in privacy can be IP address, it can be targeted advertising cookies, or it could be name and health information. It's a very broad definition. And because of that, really a privacy officer is more of a data officer with some other qualifications to allow them to interpret law and to apply policy and practice.
Talking to Stan Crosley. He is a 1985 graduate of Hillsdale College, on campus receiving an alumni award for outstanding professional achievement in data privacy and cybersecurity. There are so many interesting current questions in this field. Let's maybe take a couple of them. Just on the subject of you said Eli Lilly had data breach, which is why the position became available. There's rarely a week that goes by, even now, that we don't hear about a major data breach for a company here or a company there. You get an email that says, hey, your information's been exposed somewhere. As good as companies perhaps are at protecting data, I imagine the hackers and the people who want that data are also getting better and better at finding ways to get it.
Absolutely. In fact, it's a pretty staggering statistic. Most people probably don't realize, but companies withstand millions of cyber attacks a year to their servers, their firewalls, as well as tens of thousands. Clients have 100,000, 500,000 directed, targeted attacks to a company. And only in the last 3 months, we went from an environment where most companies would suffer. If you had an average company that would say we had 50,000 attacks on the company, cyber attacks, only about 10,000 of them would be specific to that company, right? It would be tailored to know what they do. To now, with ChatGPT and large language models, where they can just create email that looks exactly like it's coming from the CEO, the targeted attacks are now 90% of what companies suffer. So 45,000 attacks is very common for a company of, say, $1 billion in revenue a quarter.
So what about AI, ChatGPT? People are just learning about this and seeing how it works and how it interacts with our requests and commands. How does that change the game when it comes to data security and privacy?
Well, it certainly changed the data security world really rapidly. ChatGPT is used by the bad guys now, like we said, to mimic the good guys. But if you step back and think of it more from a large societal perspective, I have clients now that I've done counseling on things like deep brain implants that are used to detect seizures before they happen in epileptics, and to help that. Researchers now are saying those same deep implants may be used because of ChatGPT and large language model, may be used in replace of Adderall, right? Kids getting deep brain implants to help them focus. I've counseled on companies that have large language models that create voice simulation, that you would not be able to detect that it was not me talking right now.
I have heard some of those, and they are unbelievably accurate. We heard a lot about deep fake videos, but in a way, audio is even more dangerous.
Absolutely. No question, because you don't have the visual comparison to look at and to look at the visual cues and the body language. It's extremely difficult to replicate for AI. But voice synthesization, I have heard in my own voice, I've heard myself speaking French. Right? I don't speak French. I had 2 years in high school, and trust me, I'm not fluent in French, but my AI generated voice is, and you would not be able to know that it wasn't me.
What about you advise companies, corporations, or what they can do on a personal basis for our listeners who are getting emails and are going to be interacting with these ChatGPT outputs? What should we be doing? What can we do?
It's a really good question. And the model that I liken it to was back in the early 2000s. If you remember, if you had email, if you had a computer back then and you had an email address, you were getting all kinds of spam coming in, right? I mean, you were just getting flooded in the early 2000s with spam. And the government said, oh, we've got to pass a law. So we'll pass a law that makes it illegal to spam. The problem is that it wasn't the good guys who were going to follow the laws that were spamming. It was the bad guys who were scattered around the world that were sending spam, right? So the law did very little. But what did happen is technology advanced.
Right.
And technology is now used to filter and block spam. And so the problem largely is contained by technology. And it's the same thing that's going to happen, I think, with deep fake video, deep fake audio. It is that the technology is going to advance to be able to alert and tell you that something is probably not who you think they are. Laws will be passed to say that transparency is important so that when you're interacting with something, there's going to be a legal obligation to disclose that this is not a real person. But that's not necessarily going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
If you think about it, Scott, since 2007, when the iPhone came out, and even before that with the advent of photography, we've relied on in-person video capture to show government insurgencies, coups, police and mob brutality, right? And we've looked at those images as truth. Those days are gone. The ability to generate those images and to generate the audio that goes with them, in use by either the good guys or the bad guys,
right,
brings this to a point where we now have to figure out how we're going to try and govern through this dilemma.
I want to ask one more security question and then to talk a little bit more about Hillsdale and how it helped you in your career. Big one, TikTok. We see congressional hearings. We hear it's dangerous. We hear the Chinese government is hoovering up all this information of TikTok users. To the best of your knowledge and what you've been able to see, should we be using TikTok if we're concerned about our personal security?
I do not use TikTok. I've told my kids not to use TikTok. I have an issue with a lack of transparency around anything that is driven by the Chinese government at this point. And we can't get to the bottom of that transparency. We've seen too much of it in practice. We've seen the enforcement of laws in ways that are beneficial to the government and not necessarily to Chinese populations. And so, no, I don't believe it's trustworthy. I have a problem with banning any technology because I think that simply sends things underground. And I think that so I don't want to see us ban AI. I don't want to see us ban ChatGPT. I want to see us figure out how to utilize it. Intellectual liberty, intellectual freedom is really at issue here. And this school is in a position to do things that probably very few institutions in the world are. It's made it its passion. Intellectual freedom is a passion of this college. And it's something that we need more now than probably ever.
Stan Crosley is class of 1985 here at Hillsdale College, on campus to receive an alumni award. So tell us the lessons you learned in your years at Hillsdale. What do you think most contributed or helped you along your thicket to success to where you are today?
Hillsdale College has always been about relationships. The ability to relate to others, to the intellectual freedom, the honesty in discourse, the disagreements that came about in class and with your colleagues and your friends, but it was all about building relationships. And that was the single most important quality that I brought out of Hillsdale, was this confidence in interpersonal skills, that I could relate to someone, understand their position, and be thoughtful enough to either argue with them or to honor their position and to suggest that there may be another opportunity or another option. And that was an incredible skill. The other thing that Hillsdale subtly did in classroom and in working with professors directly in labs and else is that they taught you how to sell, right? And how to tell a story. It wasn't just about memorizing the facts. It wasn't just about, regurgitating the equations. It was actually learning and being able to tell the story of what you were doing. And I tell my law students, I teach a class at Indiana University in health privacy law, that the two most important things that you can do first to succeed is be able to sell and be able to tell a story. And if you can do those two things, you can do almost anything in this life. And those three things I've carried with me from Hillsdale, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that.
Dan Crosley, class of 1985, congratulations on the award, Outstanding Professional Achievement in Data Privacy and Cybersecurity. He is the founder and managing partner at Crosley Law Offices, creator of Red Barn Strategy, former chief privacy officer at Eli Lilly and Company. Stan, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Mollie Hemingway, Senior Journalism Fellow here at Hillsdale, Todd Mack from Hillsdale's Spanish Department, and Stan Crosley from the class of 1985. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can hear extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. The assistant producer of the program is Sam Lair. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.